Hey son, picture this. It's 1962, and somewhere in Southern California the smell of grilled beef and frying tortillas drifts through a small parking lot where cars with fins pull up to a building shaped like a sombrero. The sun is hot. The radio plays surf rock. And something very American is being built on top of something very Mexican. Tonight, we're diving into something spicier than your last argument about pineapple on pizza. The weird, wonderful, and slightly uncomfortable story of how Taco Bell turned Mexican food into American fast food. And trust me, it's more complicated than deciding between mild and fire sauce. Before we get started, if you're enjoying this kind of thing, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. And hey, we're now live on Spotify too. So if you want to drift off to sleep while learning about the cultural appropriation of the crunchy taco, the link's in the description. Now here's what you're probably wondering. How did a guy named Glenn Bell convince America that hard-shell tacos were authentic Mexican cuisine? Did anyone ask actual Mexican people what they thought? And why does every Taco Bell menu board look like it was designed by someone who took one Spanish class in high school and called it a day? When did we decide that putting Doritos on a taco was innovation and not just giving up? And perhaps most importantly, why does it still taste so good at 2 a.m. when literally nothing else is open? It's 1962 now. The fryer oil pops. A car door slams in the parking lot. Glenn Bell is standing in front of his first franchise location, watching Americans line up for something they're calling Mexican food. And whether you think that's genius or theft or both, the story is about to get very, very interesting. Let's start with the uncomfortable part. Before there was Taco Bell, there was a place called Mitla Cafe in San Bernardino, owned by a Mexican family named the Montoyas. Glenn Bell, a young entrepreneur who'd been running hamburger stands, would park across the street and watch them work. Not just watch casually, study, take notes, learn how they fried tortillas, seasoned meat, assembled tacos in assembly line fashion that made the whole operation fast enough to compete with burger joints. The Montoyas had figured something out: how to make Mexican food move at American speed. And Glenn Bell wanted to learn that secret badly enough to become what we'd now call a very dedicated observer. The Mitla Cafe sat on a corner lot where the California sun hit the windows just right in the afternoon. The smell of frying tortillas and seasoned beef drifted across the street to where Glenn had set up his hot dog stand. You could smell it before you saw it, that particular combination of cumin and grease and corn that was completely different from anything else on the block. The Montoyas had been there for years, serving food that reminded Mexican-American families of home and introducing curious white customers to flavors they'd never tasted before. Glenn Bell wasn't Mexican. He was a kid from Linwood who dropped out of high school and served in the Marines. He'd opened a hot dog stand after the war, because that's what you did if you wanted to be your own boss and didn't have much money to start with. But hot dogs were everywhere. Hamburgers were everywhere. What the Montoyas were doing, that was different. That was interesting. That looked like opportunity. So he watched. Day after day during the lunch rush, Glenn would observe the rhythm of their operation. How they pre-fried tortilla shells so they'd be ready to fill. How they kept the meat warm in a steam table. How they assembled each taco in seconds, not minutes. Speed without sacrificing taste. At least not too much. The Montoyas had created something efficient enough to work in the fast food landscape that was just beginning to emerge in post-war America. Some accounts say Glenn befriended the Montoyas. That he asked questions and they answered, generous with their knowledge. Other stories suggest it wasn't quite that friendly, that Glenn simply positioned himself close enough and observed long enough to figure out their system, without permission. The truth probably sits somewhere between those two versions, complicated by time and self-interest and the stories people tell to justify what came next. What's certain is this: Glenn Bell learned how to make tacos by watching a Mexican family do it first. He absorbed their technique, their speed, their understanding of what made Mexican food work in an American context. And then he took that knowledge and built something of his own. Whether that's entrepreneurship or something less comfortable depends on how you feel about who gets to profit from culture. The Montoyas kept running Mitla Cafe. It's still there, actually, still family-owned, still serving food that tastes like it did in the 1950s. They're a footnote in the Taco Bell story, mentioned briefly in some histories, ignored entirely in others. Meanwhile, the thing Glenn Bell built became a global empire. That distance between those two outcomes tells you something about America in the 1950s. It tells you who got to scale up and who stayed small. It tells you whose version of Mexican food became the dominant one and why. So here's what happened next. Glenn Bell didn't just admire the Montoyas from afar. He asked questions. He befriended them, or tried to. Some accounts say they taught him willingly. Others suggest he simply stood there long enough to reverse engineer their entire operation. Either way, by the mid-1950s, Glenn had opened his own taco stand called Taco Tia, serving food that looked an awful lot like what the Montoyas had been making. The Montoyas kept running Mitla Cafe. Glenn kept expanding. And nobody back then seemed to ask whether this was entrepreneurship or something a little more ethically complicated. It was just business. That's what people said. Taco Tia opened in 1954 on a dusty corner in San Bernardino. The building was small, nothing fancy, just a walk-up window where you could order and a few outdoor tables where you could eat if you didn't mind the heat. Glenn had figured out the basics. Fry the tortilla shells ahead of time, keep them warm, fill them fast. Ground beef seasoned with chili powder and cumin. Shredded lettuce. A squeeze of mild sauce. It wasn't complicated. That was the whole point. The food tasted good enough. Not authentic in any traditional sense, but tasty in the way that fried things covered in seasoned meat and cheese tend to be tasty. Americans who'd never had a real taco didn't know the difference. They just knew it was different from a hamburger, exotic enough to feel like an adventure, but familiar enough not to be threatening. Glenn charged 19 cents for a taco, about the same as a burger. The value proposition was clear. What Glenn understood, and what made him successful, was that most Americans in the 1950s didn't want authentic Mexican food. They wanted something that felt Mexican without challenging them too much. They wanted the idea of Mexico, filtered through an American sensibility that prioritized speed and convenience and mild flavors. Taco Tia gave them exactly that. Meanwhile, the Montoyas continued operating Mitla Cafe the way they always had. They didn't franchise. They didn't expand. They served their community and the occasional curious outsider who'd heard about the place. They made food the way their family had made it for generations, with attention and care, and ingredients that actually tasted like something. But they didn't have Glenn Bell's ambition, or his access to capital, or his understanding of how to turn a single location into a reproducible system. This is where borrowing becomes building, where the line gets blurry. Glenn didn't steal recipes in any legal sense. He observed, learned, adapted. He took what the Montoyas had created and made it faster, simpler, more scalable. He removed the parts that required skill or tradition or time. He kept the parts that could be systematized, that could be taught to anyone in an afternoon. He transformed craft into process. Some people call that innovation. Others call it appropriation. The truth is it's both, and that's what makes it uncomfortable. Glenn Bell built something real. Tacotia became successful enough that he could open more locations, refine the system, eventually sell the chain, and start over with a new concept that would become Taco Bell. He created jobs, fed people, made money. Those are real accomplishments. But he built it on a foundation that wasn't entirely his own. He built it by watching a Mexican family perfect a system and then replicating that system without them. He built it in a culture that was more willing to give a white entrepreneur capital and opportunity than it was to support the Mexican families who'd been making the food all along. And that matters. That asymmetry, that structural advantage, is part of the story too. Nobody asked these questions in 1954. The language of cultural appropriation didn't exist yet. People just saw a guy with a taco stand, making money, expanding. That was the American dream, wasn't it? The fact that he'd learned how to make tacos from someone else seemed irrelevant. Learning from others, that's just smart business. Except when it's not. Except when the learning flows in one direction and the profit flows the same way, and the people who originated the knowledge stay exactly where they were. Here's the thing most people don't know. The hard-shell taco, that U-shaped crunchy vessel we associate with Taco Bell, wasn't traditional Mexican food. It was an invention born from speed and convenience. Mexicans had been eating tacos for centuries, but they were soft. Corn tortillas, warm and pliable, folded around fillings. The hard shell was an American adaptation, something that could be pre-fried, stacked, stored, and assembled quickly during a lunch rush. Glenn Bell didn't invent the concept, but he perfected the system. And in doing so, he created something that wasn't quite Mexican and wasn't quite American. It was something new, something faster, something a 1950s housewife in the suburbs could pick up on the way home without thinking twice. The crunchy taco shell solved a problem that only existed in the context of fast food. If you're making tacos at home or in a traditional taqueria, you heat the tortilla as you need it. It takes seconds. You keep them warm wrapped in cloth. Each taco is made fresh, the tortilla still soft and pliable. But that doesn't scale. That doesn't work when you're trying to serve 50 people during a 30-minute lunch rush, and you've only got 2 teenagers working the line. So someone, and accounts differ on exactly who, figured out that you could fry tortillas ahead of time, bend them into a U-shape while they were still hot, and let them cool into rigid shells. These shells could be stacked. They could be stored. They could sit for hours, even days, waiting to be filled. When an order came in, you just grabbed a shell, stuffed it, and handed it over. 15 seconds from order to delivery. The texture was completely different from a traditional taco. Hard instead of soft. Crunchy instead of tender. It shattered when you bit into it, sending shards of fried corn down your shirt. It wasn't better, but it was faster. And in the emerging fast food landscape of the 1950s, faster was better. Faster meant you could serve more customers. Faster meant lower labor costs. Faster meant profit. Glenn Bell didn't invent the pre-fried taco shell, but he understood its potential better than almost anyone. He refined the frying process, the storage method, the assembly line. He figured out exactly how long the shells could sit before they went stale. He determined the ideal thickness, the right temperature for frying, the perfect curve that would hold the filling without collapsing. He turned a novelty into a system, and that system created a new category of food. The crunchy taco wasn't Mexican food. It wasn't American food either, not in any traditional sense. It was fast food that happened to use Mexican flavors and ingredients. It was its own thing, born from the collision of 2 cultures, but not really belonging to either one. That's what made it successful. It could be marketed as exotic without being foreign. It could claim authenticity without actually being authentic. For most Americans in the 1950s and 60s, the crunchy taco became the template. This was what a taco was. This was what Mexican food looked like. They didn't know about tacos al pastor or carnitas, or the dozens of regional variations that existed across Mexico. They knew the hard shell filled with ground beef and lettuce. That was the reference point. That was the standard. Mexican and Mexican-American families knew better, of course. They'd been making real tacos all along. But their knowledge didn't shape the mainstream understanding. Taco Bell did. The crunchy taco did. The version that could be mass-produced and franchised and advertised on television became the dominant narrative. There's something both brilliant and sad about that. Brilliant because Glenn Bell figured out how to take a complex culinary tradition and make it accessible to millions of people who would never have encountered it otherwise. Sad because in making it accessible, he stripped away most of what made it meaningful. The crunchy taco was Mexican food with all the Mexicanness removed, leaving only the parts that could be industrialized. But it tasted good. That's the thing you can't ignore. For all its inauthenticity, for all the ways it diverged from tradition, the crunchy taco was delicious in its own right. Salty, crunchy, satisfying, easy to eat, fun even in a messy, unpretentious way. It didn't pretend to be fine dining. It just promised to taste good and be cheap and be ready in minutes. And it delivered on that promise every single time. When Glenn Bell decided to franchise his operation in 1962, he needed a name. Not just any name. Something catchy. Something that told customers exactly what they were getting without making them nervous. Taco Bell. Simple, friendly. Vaguely ethnic, but not threatening. The Bell part, well, that was just his last name. But it worked. It sounded cheerful. It sounded American. It didn't sound like the kind of place where you'd need to speak Spanish or know what mole was or feel out of your depth. Taco Bell promised you could show up, order in English, and get something that tasted foreign enough to feel adventurous, but safe enough to feed your kids. That's what made it brilliant. Names matter in ways that aren't always obvious. The wrong name can kill a business before it starts. Too ethnic, and you scare away the mainstream customers you need to survive. Too generic, and you disappear into the noise of every other restaurant on the block. Glenn Bell understood this instinctively. He'd already had experience with restaurant names through Taco Tia and his earlier ventures. He knew what worked. Taco Bell hit the sweet spot. The word taco told you exactly what you were buying. No confusion, no mystery. You didn't need to know anything about Mexican food to understand that this place served tacos. And Bell, well, that was as American as it got. Bells on churches. Liberty Bell. Bell-shaped buildings that looked friendly and inviting. The name created an instant association. This is Mexican food for Americans, made by an American, served in a way Americans would understand and appreciate. The name also did something subtle and important. It positioned Glenn Bell as the authority, the creator, the brand, not the Montoyas, not any Mexican chef or family with generations of knowledge. Glenn Bell. His name was on the sign. His name was on the napkins and the cups, and eventually on the stock certificates when the company went public. The name claimed ownership in a way that was both legal and symbolic. Compare that to authentic Mexican restaurants, most of which were named after families or regions or saints. Names that connected the food to its origins, to specific places and people and traditions. Taco Bell severed that connection. It created something new that didn't owe anything to the past, at least not officially. The name suggested that this was Glenn Bell's invention, his creation, rather than an adaptation of someone else's culture. And it worked. The name was easy to remember, easy to pronounce, easy to recognize from a distance. When you were driving down the street looking for somewhere to eat, it looked good on signs. It sounded good in commercials. It translated well as the company expanded beyond California into states where Mexican food was still relatively unknown. The name also allowed Taco Bell to be whatever it needed to be. It wasn't claiming to be authentic. It wasn't promising traditional Mexican cuisine. It was just Taco Bell, its own category, its own thing. That gave the company freedom to experiment, to add menu items that made no sense in any traditional Mexican context, to adapt and change based on what American customers wanted rather than what Mexican tradition demanded. Some people found the name charming. Others found it presumptuous. Here was a white guy putting his name on Mexican food, claiming it as his own. But most people didn't think about it that deeply. They just saw a place that sold tacos, had a catchy name, and didn't intimidate them. That was enough. The genius of the name became even more apparent as the company grew. Taco Bell could open locations anywhere in America, even in small towns where people had never encountered Mexican food. The name didn't require any cultural knowledge or context. It didn't ask anything of the customer except willingness to try something a little different. And because the food itself had been engineered to be approachable, the name and the product worked together perfectly. There's also something revealing about what the name didn't include. No mention of Mexico. No Spanish words except taco, which had already been somewhat adopted into English by the 1960s. No reference to any region or tradition or heritage. Just Taco Bell. Clean, simple, American. That simplicity was strategic. Glenn Bell was building a business, not preserving a culture. The name reflected that priority. It sold food, not history. It promised convenience, not authenticity. And for millions of Americans who just wanted something quick and tasty for lunch, that was exactly what they were looking for. Meanwhile, in actual Mexico and in Mexican-American communities across the Southwest, people were eating something entirely different. Tacos al pastor, carnitas, barbacoa, corn tortillas made fresh every morning, not fried into rigid shells, salsas with depth and heat, not packaged sauce squirted from a gun, food that took time, care, tradition. Food that connected families to regions, to grandmothers, to centuries of culinary history. Taco Bell wasn't serving that. Taco Bell was serving a version of Mexican food that had been translated, simplified, and sped up for a culture that wanted things fast, cheap, and familiar. And there's nothing wrong with wanting that. But it's worth knowing what got lost in translation. Real Mexican food, the kind being made in homes and taquerias and street stands across Mexico and the American Southwest, bore almost no resemblance to what Taco Bell was serving. The difference wasn't just in quality or authenticity. It was in philosophy, in approach, in what food was supposed to be and do. Take tortillas. In a traditional Mexican kitchen or taqueria, tortillas were made from corn that had been nixtamalized, a process where dried corn kernels are soaked and cooked in an alkaline solution, usually lime water. This process, thousands of years old, makes the nutrients in corn more bioavailable and gives the tortillas a distinctive flavor and aroma. The treated corn is then ground into masa, a dough that's pressed into thin circles and cooked on a hot griddle. The whole process takes time and skill. The result is a tortilla that's soft, pliable, with a flavor that's earthy and slightly sweet. Nothing like the fried shells at Taco Bell. The fillings were different too. Real tacos featured specific cuts of meat prepared in traditional ways. Carnitas, pork that's been slowly braised in its own fat until it's tender and crispy at the same time. Barbacoa, traditionally lamb or beef wrapped in maguey leaves and cooked underground for hours. Tacos al pastor, marinated pork cooked on a vertical spit. influenced by Lebanese immigrants who brought shawarma to Mexico in the early 20th century. Each style had a history, a technique, a specific flavor profile that took years to master. And the salsas. Real Mexican salsas weren't just hot sauce. They were complex combinations of chilies, tomatoes, tomatillos, onions, cilantro, lime. Some were raw, fresh, and bright. Others were cooked, charred, blended. Each salsa was designed to complement specific dishes, to add layers of flavor, not just heat. A good salsa could be smoky, tangy, fruity, earthy, all at the same time. It required knowledge and judgment and taste. This was food that carried meaning beyond nutrition or convenience. It connected people to place. A specific salsa recipe might come from Oaxaca, handed down through generations. A particular way of preparing mole might be unique to one family in Puebla. Food was identity. It was history. It was a way of maintaining connection to home, even when home was hundreds or thousands of miles away. For Mexican-American families in the Southwest, these traditions weren't abstract or exotic. They were daily life. Grandmothers making tortillas by hand. Mothers teaching daughters how to make tamales for Christmas. Families gathering on weekends for carne asada, grilling meat and making fresh salsas and eating together. Food was how culture survived, how it was transmitted from one generation to the next. And none of that existed at Taco Bell. Taco Bell offered speed and convenience and a flavor profile designed to appeal to the broadest possible audience. It wasn't trying to preserve tradition. It was trying to make money. Those are different goals, and they produce different results. The tragedy, if you want to call it that, is that for millions of Americans, Taco Bell became the reference point. Their understanding of Mexican food was shaped by hard-shell tacos filled with ground beef. They didn't know about mole or pozole or the regional variations of tamales. They didn't know that Mexico has incredible culinary diversity, that food from Yucatan tastes nothing like food from Jalisco. They just knew Taco Bell, and they thought that was Mexican food. Some Mexican-American families watched this happen with frustration. They'd been making the real thing all along, and nobody cared. Their restaurants stayed small, served mostly their own communities, struggled to compete with the marketing power and convenience of chains like Taco Bell. Others accepted it as inevitable, a price of assimilation, the way culture gets diluted and transformed in America. But the food remained. In homes and small taquerias and food trucks, people kept making real Mexican food, kept teaching their children the old techniques, kept honoring the traditions that Taco Bell ignored. That persistence matters. It means the real thing survived, even if it never achieved the commercial success of the imitation. By the mid-1960s, Glenn Bell had figured out something crucial. You could teach anyone to make this food. You didn't need a chef. You didn't need someone's abuela in the kitchen. You needed a manual, pre-portioned ingredients, and teenagers willing to work for minimum wage. The franchise model made Taco Bell scalable in a way traditional Mexican restaurants could never be. Every location looked the same. Every taco tasted the same. You could walk into a Taco Bell in California or Kansas or Florida and know exactly what you were getting. That consistency was the whole point. It was McDonald's logic applied to Mexican food. And it worked. The franchise model revolutionized American food, and Taco Bell was part of that revolution. Glenn Bell had watched McDonald's expand through franchising in the 1950s. He'd seen how Ray Kroc had taken a single successful restaurant and turned it into hundreds of identical locations by creating systems that removed skill and judgment from the equation. Every hamburger made the same way. Every French fry cooked at the same temperature for the same amount of time. Every location a perfect replica of every other location. Glenn Bell applied that same logic to Mexican food. The first step was standardization. Every ingredient had to be exactly the same at every location. That meant partnering with suppliers who could deliver pre-seasoned ground beef, pre-shredded cheese, pre-cut lettuce. It meant developing specifications for every single item, down to the temperature the tortilla shells should be fried and the exact amount of filling each taco should contain. The operations manual was the key. It documented every process, every procedure, every task that needed to happen to run a Taco Bell. How to open in the morning, how to prep ingredients, how to take orders, how to assemble tacos, how to clean at the end of the night. Nothing was left to chance or individual judgment. If you followed the manual exactly, you would produce the same food, the same service, the same experience as every other Taco Bell. This approach had enormous advantages. It meant you could hire people with no cooking experience and have them making tacos within hours. It meant you could open new locations quickly without worrying about finding skilled workers. It meant costs were predictable and controlled. Labor became cheap and interchangeable. Ingredients were standardized and purchased in bulk. The profit margins were clear and reproducible. It also meant that quality was consistent, at least within the narrow definition of quality that Taco Bell aimed for. A taco at one location tasted exactly like a taco at another location. That consistency was valuable to customers. They knew what they were getting. There were no surprises, no variations, no risk that they'd order something and hate it. Taco Bell was reliable. But this system also required stripping away everything that couldn't be standardized. Traditional Mexican cooking involves judgment and adaptation. You taste the salsa and adjust the seasoning. You check the texture of the mesa and add a little more water if needed. You watch the meat and know when it's ready based on how it looks and smells. That kind of knowledge takes time to develop and can't be easily documented in a manual. Taco Bell removed all of that. Every measurement was exact. Every temperature was specified. Every timing was predetermined. There was no room for intuition or expertise. In fact, expertise was a liability. If an employee knew how to actually cook Mexican food, they might be tempted to deviate from the system, to improve things. Taco Bell didn't want improvement. It wanted consistency. The franchise model also changed who could own a Taco Bell. You didn't need to know anything about Mexican food or culture. You just needed capital and a willingness to follow the system. Franchisees came from all backgrounds. Many had no connection to Mexican or Mexican-American communities. They were business people, investors, entrepreneurs looking for opportunity. They bought a franchise, hired staff, followed the manual, and collected profits. This democratized ownership in one sense. Anyone with money could own a Taco Bell, but it also severed the connection between the food and the culture it came from. A traditional Mexican restaurant was usually owned by someone with deep knowledge of the cuisine, someone connected to the tradition. Taco Bell franchises could be owned by anyone. The food became completely detached from its origins. By 1967, Glen Bell had sold 75 franchises. By the early 1970s, there were hundreds of locations. Each one was identical. Each one was profitable. The model worked almost too well. Taco Bell was growing faster than almost any other restaurant chain. Proof that you could take ethnic food, strip away the ethnicity, and scale it into a national brand. Traditional Mexican restaurants couldn't compete with that. They couldn't standardize. Their food depended on the knowledge and skill of specific cooks. They couldn't mass produce. They couldn't guarantee consistency across multiple locations. They couldn't match the marketing budgets or the expansion speed. The franchise model gave Taco Bell structural advantages that had nothing to do with the quality of the food and everything to do with the efficiency of the business. In 1964, You could buy a Taco Bell taco for about 70 cents. A burger at McDonald's cost roughly the same. The brilliance wasn't the price. It was what the price represented. Mexican food was no longer exotic or expensive, or something you needed to seek out in a specific neighborhood. It was just another option in the fast food landscape. Cheap, fast, accessible. For many Americans, especially those living far from the Southwest, Taco Bell was their first encounter with anything resembling Mexican cuisine. And that taco, crunchy and mild, and filled with seasoned ground beef and shredded iceberg lettuce, became the template. It became what people thought Mexican food was supposed to taste like. 70 cents bought you something specific in 1964. It bought you a hard-shell taco, pre-fried and waiting. It bought you ground beef that had been cooked in bulk and kept warm in a steam table, seasoned with a proprietary blend that included chili powder, cumin, and salt. It bought you shredded iceberg lettuce, the cheapest and crunchiest option available. It bought you a small handful of shredded cheddar cheese, the processed kind that melted easily and tasted mild. And it bought you a squeeze of mild taco sauce, red and slightly sweet, nothing that would challenge anyone's palate. That was it. Nothing complicated, nothing that required skill to assemble. The teenager behind the counter grabbed a shell, spooned in the meat, added the lettuce and cheese, squeezed the sauce, and handed it over wrapped in thin paper. The whole transaction took less than a minute from order to delivery. Fast food in the most literal sense. But that 70-cent taco represented something bigger than its ingredients. It represented access. Before Taco Bell, if you wanted Mexican food and you lived in Iowa or Ohio or Massachusetts, you had limited options. Maybe there was a single Mexican restaurant in the nearest city if you were lucky. Maybe you had a Mexican-American neighbor who occasionally invited you over. But mostly Mexican food was regional, concentrated in the Southwest, unavailable to most Americans. Taco Bell changed that. The franchise model meant Taco Bell could open anywhere. Small towns, suburbs, highway exits, places where no Mexican person had ever lived or worked. The 70-cent taco brought Mexican flavors, however simplified, to people who would never have encountered them otherwise. It democratized access in a way that traditional restaurants never could. That accessibility came with trade-offs. The food was simplified, made palatable to the broadest possible audience. It was mild when traditional Mexican food could be spicy. It was predictable when traditional Mexican food was diverse and regional. It was fast when traditional Mexican food often required slow cooking and careful preparation. But it was available. And for many Americans, that availability mattered more than authenticity. The price point was also strategic. 70 cents was impulse purchase territory. It was lunch money for kids. It was pocket change for adults. It was cheap enough that you could try it without risk. If you hated it, you were only out 70 cents. That low barrier to entry encouraged experimentation. People who would never have gone to a Mexican restaurant, who would have been intimidated by unfamiliar menus and unknown flavors, were willing to try a 70-cent taco. And most people liked it. The taco was engineered to be likable. Not challenging, not complex, but satisfying in a simple way. Crunchy, salty, meaty, filling. It hit familiar flavor notes while adding just enough cumin and chili powder to feel different. It was comfort food with a slight twist. That 70-cent taco also created expectations. For millions of Americans who tried Taco Bell as their first Mexican food experience, that taco became the standard. When they thought about Mexican food, they thought about that flavor profile, that texture, that experience. If they later encountered real Mexican food, it often seemed too different, too spicy, too unfamiliar. They'd already formed their mental model of what a taco should be, and Taco Bell had created that model. The economics of the 70-cent taco were clever too. The ingredients were cheap: ground beef, lettuce, cheese, and a fried tortilla shell cost pennies. The markup was substantial. Labor costs were minimal because the assembly required no skill. Taco Bell could sell tacos for 70 cents and still make healthy profits on every sale. As the chain grew and could negotiate better prices with suppliers, those profits only increased. That 70-cent taco also became a marketing tool. Taco Bell could advertise heavily, run promotions, give away free tacos, because each one costs so little to produce. The company could afford to be aggressive with pricing and promotions in ways that traditional Mexican restaurants couldn't match. They could compete with other fast food chains on price while offering something that felt different, exotic, special. By the late 1960s, Taco Bell was selling millions of those 70-cent tacos every year. Each one was identical. Each one tasted exactly the same. And each one carried the implicit message: this is what Mexican food is. Not the food being made in homes and taquerias across the Southwest. Not the regional cuisines of Mexico itself. Just this: the crunchy shell, the ground beef, the mild sauce. That was the definition, at least for mainstream America. Not everyone was celebrating. Mexican-American families who'd been running taquerias and restaurants for generations watched Taco Bell expand with a mixture of frustration and resignation. They'd been serving authentic food for years, sometimes decades, often in neighborhoods where white customers rarely ventured. And now here was Glenn Bell, a white businessman, making millions by selling a simplified version of their culture. Some saw it as theft. Others saw it as inevitable. A few even admitted that Taco Bell, for all its inauthenticity, was introducing Mexican flavors to people who might never have tried them otherwise. It was complicated. It still is. The Lopez family had been running a taqueria in East Los Angeles since the 1940s. 3 generations working together, making tortillas by hand every morning, slow-cooking carnitas in copper pots, preparing salsas from recipes that had been in the family for decades. Their restaurant served the neighborhood, mostly Mexican and Mexican-American families who appreciated authentic food made with care. They made enough to survive, to keep the lights on, to pass the business to the next generation. And then they watched Taco Bell open a location 6 blocks away. The building was new, bright, painted in colors that were supposed to evoke Mexico, but looked like nothing in Mexico. The sign was huge, visible from blocks away. The parking lot was always full. White families, black families, people from outside the neighborhood who'd never set foot in the Lopez Taqueria lined up at Taco Bell during lunch and dinner. The food at Taco Bell bore little resemblance to what the Lopez's were making, but customers didn't seem to care. They wanted cheap and fast. They wanted familiar flavors in unfamiliar packaging. They wanted to feel adventurous without actually taking any risks. Taco Bell gave them exactly that. The frustration for families like the Lopez's was multi-layered. There was the obvious economic impact. Taco Bell was drawing customers who might have come to their restaurant. But it was deeper than that. It felt personal. Here was their culture, their food, their heritage, being repackaged and sold by someone with no connection to it. And succeeding, making more money in a month than they made in a year. Some Mexican-American restaurant owners tried to compete. They lowered prices. They added drive-through windows. They simplified menus. A few succeeded. Most didn't. They couldn't match Taco Bell's marketing budget or buying power or brand recognition. They couldn't scale the way a franchise could, and they couldn't or wouldn't strip their food down to the bare minimum the way Taco Bell had. There were also Mexican-American workers at Taco Bell. teenagers from the neighborhood earning minimum wage to assemble tacos that bore little resemblance to what their grandmothers made at home. The irony wasn't lost on them. Here they were, making money off a corporate version of their own culture, serving it to people who had no idea what real Mexican food tasted like. Some older Mexican Americans saw Taco Bell as part of a broader pattern. American culture had always taken things from Mexican culture without acknowledgement or compensation. Music, art, language, food. It borrowed, adapted, profited. The people who created the culture rarely benefited from its commercialization. Taco Bell was just the latest example. But there were other perspectives too. Some Mexican Americans argued that Taco Bell was actually good for Mexican food in the long run. It introduced flavors and concepts to millions of Americans who would never have encountered them otherwise. Sure, the food was simplified, bastardized even, but it created curiosity. Some percentage of people who tried Taco Bell would eventually seek out real Mexican food. They'd find their way to authentic taquerias and restaurants. Taco Bell was a gateway, however imperfect. This argument didn't convince everyone. The counter-argument was that Taco Bell actually made it harder for authentic Mexican restaurants to succeed. By defining Mexican food as cheap, fast, and mild, Taco Bell set expectations that authentic restaurants couldn't meet. When people tried real Mexican food and found it different from what they expected, they often rejected it. They wanted the Taco Bell version, not the authentic version. Taco Bell had colonized the category. There was also pride at stake. Mexican and Mexican-American families took pride in their food, in their culinary traditions. Seeing those traditions reduced to ground beef in a hard shell was painful. It felt dismissive, disrespectful. As if all the complexity and history and regional variation of Mexican cuisine could be reduced to 19 cents worth of ingredients assembled in 15 seconds. Some families stopped caring what mainstream America thought. They cooked for themselves, for their communities, for people who understood and appreciated the real thing. They didn't need validation from white customers or commercial success on Taco Bell's terms. They had their traditions, and those traditions would survive regardless of what happened in the fast food landscape. Others adapted. They opened restaurants that split the difference, offering some authentic dishes and some Americanized options. They served both communities, code switching between menus. It was pragmatic, if not ideologically pure. You do what you need to do to survive. Watching Taco Bell expand through the 1960s and 70s was like watching a parallel reality unfold. In one reality, Mexican food was slow-cooked carnitas and handmade tortillas and complex mole sauces. In another reality, Mexican food was hard-shell tacos filled with ground beef. Both realities existed simultaneously, but only one was getting rich. Only one was going national. Only one was being advertised on television and built into shopping centers across America. The families who'd been making real Mexican food all along didn't disappear. They kept cooking. They kept teaching their children. They kept honoring their traditions. But they did it in the shadow of Taco Bell's success, watching a white businessman profit from a simplified version of their culture while they struggled to pay rent. That experience, that particular flavor of frustration and resignation, is part of the Taco Bell story too. When Taco Bell added drive-through service in the early 1970s, it was over. You didn't even have to get out of your car anymore. You could pull up, shout your order into a crackling speaker, and drive away with a bag of tacos. It was convenience maximized, and it was the final nail in the coffin for any illusion that this was about cultural appreciation. This was about speed, efficiency, profit. Mexican food had been fully absorbed into the American fast food machine, and there was no turning back. The drive-thru made Taco Bell not just popular, but essential. It became part of the weekly routine for millions of families. Tuesday night. Taco Bell. No one even questioned it anymore. The first Taco Bell drive-thru opened in 1970, though the exact location is disputed. What matters is what it represented. The drive-thru window was the logical endpoint of the convenience trajectory that had been building since the 1950s. Why get out of your car? Why walk inside? Why sit down? Just pull up, place your order, grab your food, and keep moving. The technology was simple. A speaker system connected to the kitchen. A window where money and food changed hands. A menu board positioned so drivers could read it while waiting. The whole setup cost a few $1,000s to install and immediately increased sales at every location that added one. The drive-thru captured customers who would have driven past otherwise, people in a hurry, people who didn't want to deal with parking, people who were eating in their cars anyway. For Taco Bell, the drive-thru was perfect. The food was already designed to be portable. Tacos came wrapped in paper. They could be eaten with one hand. They didn't require plates or utensils. You could eat them while driving, which people absolutely did despite the obvious safety concerns. The drive-thru turned Taco Bell into fuel, something you grabbed on the way to somewhere else. It also changed the relationship between customer and food. When you sat inside a restaurant, even a fast food restaurant, there was at least minimal ceremony. You walked in, you sat down, you unwrapped your food, you ate. There was a moment, however brief, where the food was the focus. The drive-thru eliminated even that. Food became purely transactional. You exchanged money for calories. The food was just the thing that happened between ordering and wherever you were going next. This suited Taco Bell perfectly. The food had already been engineered for speed and convenience. The drive-thru was just the logical extension. You could get your tacos in less than 3 minutes from pulling up to driving away. Faster than McDonald's, faster than Burger King, fast enough that Taco Bell became the obvious choice when you were really in a hurry. The drive-thru also expanded Taco Bell's customer base. Some people never would have walked into a Mexican restaurant, even a fast food Mexican restaurant. It felt too unfamiliar, too foreign. But pulling through a drive-thru felt safe. It felt American. It was the same process they used at every other fast food restaurant. They could try Taco Bell without committing, without having to interact with employees or navigate an unfamiliar environment. For families, the drive-thru was a lifesaver. You could feed everyone without getting the kids out of the car, without managing them in a restaurant, without dealing with the chaos of ordering and eating and cleaning up in public. Just pull through. Grab a bag of tacos and burritos, hand them to the kids in the back seat, and keep driving. Dinner was handled. The drive-thru also enabled new eating occasions. Juaniti. Night became huge. After bars closed, after parties ended, Taco Bell drive-thrus stayed open. Drunk college students, night shift workers, insomniacs, anyone who needed food at 2 a.m. could pull through and get tacos. This created a whole new association in American culture. Taco Bell as late-night food, as drunk food, as the thing you craved when your judgment was impaired and everything tasted amazing. But the drive-thru also represented something more symbolic. It was the final severing of any connection between the food and its cultural origins. Traditional Mexican food was about gathering, about family, about taking time. You made tortillas together. You cooked together. You ate together. Food was social, communal, meaningful beyond nutrition. The drive-thru was the opposite of all that. It was solitary, rushed, purely functional. You ate alone in your car, often while doing something else, on your way to somewhere more important. The food was just fuel. It had no meaning beyond satisfying immediate hunger. And that's what Taco Bell had become. Not Mexican food, Not even Americanized Mexican food, just fast food that happened to use Mexican flavors. The drive-thru made that transformation complete. By the mid-1970s, you could spend your entire Taco Bell experience without ever leaving your car, without ever interacting with another human beyond a few words through a speaker, without ever thinking about where this food came from or what it meant or who had created the original versions. The drive-thru sealed the deal. Taco Bell was no longer about cultural exchange or introducing Americans to new cuisines. It was about efficiency. It was about extracting maximum profit from minimum labor and ingredients. It was about fitting into the rhythms of American life, which were getting faster and more atomized every year. The drive-thru was perfect for that world, and Taco Bell was perfect for the drive-thru. Let's talk about the menu. The enchilada, the Mexican pizza, the Crunchwrap Supreme. These weren't dishes you'd find in Guadalajara or Oaxaca. They were inventions, mashups, things designed by marketing teams and test kitchens trying to figure out what Americans would buy. And Americans bought them enthusiastically. Because Taco Bell had never promised authenticity. It promised flavor, novelty, and a price point that made experimentation feel risk-free. You could try something called a gordita, and if you hated it, you were only out a couple bucks. That freedom, that low-stakes adventure, was part of the appeal. But it also meant that for a generation of Americans, this was Mexican food. Not a version of it, just it. The enchilada appeared on Taco Bell menus in 1970. It was, according to the marketing copy, a combination of an enchilada and a burrito. In practice, it was a flour tortilla filled with seasoned beef and beans, topped with red sauce and cheese, and served swimming in more sauce. It bore no resemblance to any traditional Mexican dish. Enchiladas are corn tortillas dipped in chili sauce, filled, rolled, and baked. Burritos are flour tortillas filled and rolled, usually served dry. The enchilada was neither, but Americans didn't care. It was tasty in a messy, indulgent way. The Mexican pizza came later, in the 1980s. 2 fried flour tortillas with seasoned beef, beans, cheese, and sauce between them, topped with more cheese, tomatoes, and green onions. It was called pizza because it was flat and round and had toppings, not because it had anything to do with pizza or Mexican food. But it was delicious in its own chaotic way, and it became one of Taco Bell's most popular items. The Crunchwrap Supreme arrived in the 2000s, a hexagonal monstrosity that somehow contained a hard taco shell inside a soft flour tortilla, along with beef, cheese, lettuce, tomatoes, and sour cream. It was engineering, not cooking. Someone had figured out how to fold a tortilla around a hard shell so the whole thing stayed together. It was completely ridiculous. It was also incredibly popular. These menu items represented Taco Bell's evolution from copying Mexican food to creating its own category. The company had stopped even pretending to serve authentic cuisine. Instead, it was inventing new foods, using Mexican ingredients and flavors as a starting point, but going wherever customer demand led. If Americans wanted a pizza made with tortillas, fine. If they wanted a burrito wrapped around a taco, great. The only constraint was what people would buy. This approach had a certain logic. Taco Bell had already trained Americans to accept its version of Mexican food. Why not push further? Why not see how weird you could get while still maintaining the core flavor profile that customers expected? The test kitchens became laboratories for experimentation. What if you fried a burrito? What if you wrapped a quesadilla around a chalupa? What if you put Doritos on literally everything? For Mexican and Mexican-American people watching this evolution, it was surreal. These weren't adaptations of traditional dishes. They weren't even coherent attempts to create something Mexican. They were pure American invention, focus grouped and market tested, designed to maximize appeal and profit. The names often use Spanish words, but the food itself had severed any connection to Mexican cuisine. Yet the menu also revealed something about American culture and American appetites. We wanted novelty. We wanted things that felt different without actually being challenging. We wanted adventure that came with guardrails. Taco Bell gave us exactly that. Every new menu item was different enough to feel interesting, but familiar enough to be safe. You knew it would be salty, cheesy, filling. You knew it would taste like Taco Bell. The novelty was in the format, the presentation, the creative combination of the same basic ingredients. The menu also showcased American excess. Mexican food, traditional Mexican food, tends toward balance. Each element serves a purpose. The flavors work together. American fast food tends toward more cheese, more meat, more sauce, bigger portions. The Taco Bell menu embodied that philosophy. The portions were large. The flavors were bold in a simplified way. Everything was designed to feel indulgent, like you were getting more than you paid for. Price remained crucial. Most menu items cost under $3. Some cost less than $2. That pricing meant you could experiment freely. You could try the new weird menu item without worry. If it was terrible, you were only out a couple bucks. That low-risk experimentation drove sales of new items and kept customers coming back to see what Taco Bell would invent next. The menu also created its own vocabulary. Americans learned words like gordita, chalupa, quesadilla, but they learned Taco Bell's definitions, not the traditional ones. A chalupa in Mexico is a fried corn tortilla shaped like a boat, topped simply with salsa, cheese, and maybe shredded chicken. A Taco Bell chalupa is a fried flour tortilla shell filled with beef, cheese, lettuce, tomatoes, and sour cream. The word was the same. The food was completely different. This linguistic appropriation bothered some people. Taco Bell was taking Spanish words, Mexican food terms, and attaching them to things that bore no resemblance to the originals. It muddied the waters, made it harder for people to understand what authentic Mexican food actually was. When someone said they loved chalupas, did they mean the Taco Bell version or the traditional version? Usually they meant Taco Bell, because that's the only version they'd ever encountered. But from Taco Bell's perspective, the menu was a success. It gave customers choice, novelty, value. It kept the brand feeling fresh and innovative. It generated media coverage and social media buzz. Every new menu item became a mini event, something people talked about and tried and shared pictures of online. The menu wasn't about respecting Mexican cuisine. It was about keeping customers engaged and coming back. And it worked. Millions of Americans couldn't tell you the difference between a traditional enchilada and an enchilada, but they could tell you exactly what a Crunchwrap Supreme tasted like. That was the world Taco Bell had created. A parallel food universe where Mexican-sounding words meant whatever Taco Bell decided they meant, where authenticity was irrelevant and innovation meant finding new ways to combine the same 5 ingredients. In 1997, Taco Bell introduced a talking Chihuahua in its commercials. The dog had a catchphrase, "Yo quiero Taco Bell," I want Taco Bell. The ads were everywhere. The dog became a cultural phenomenon. And a lot of people, especially in the Mexican-American community, were uncomfortable. The Chihuahua felt like a caricature, a lazy shorthand for Mexican culture that reduced it to a punchline. Taco Bell didn't see it that way. They saw a lovable mascot that sold tacos, and it did. It sold millions of them. But it also crystallized something uncomfortable. Taco Bell wasn't just selling food. It was selling a version of Mexican identity that existed only in American imaginations. And that little dog, cute as it was, became a symbol of that disconnect. The Chihuahua appeared on television screens across America, a tiny tan dog with enormous eyes and a Spanish accent, provided by voice actor Carlos Alazraqui. The commercials were simple. The dog would appear in various scenarios, always expressing its desire for Taco Bell in broken Spanish-accented English. Yo quiero Taco Bell became an instant catchphrase. Kids repeated it. Adults repeated it. It showed up on T-shirts and bumper stickers. From a marketing perspective, the campaign was brilliant. The dog was cute, memorable, and perfectly designed to appeal to the broadest possible audience. The commercials were funny without being mean. The dog was aspirational in a silly way, always scheming to get Taco Bell, always foiled in its attempts. Americans loved it. Sales increased dramatically. The Chihuahua became more recognizable than most human celebrities, but the campaign also revealed assumptions about Mexican culture that many people found troubling. Why was the mascot for Mexican food a Chihuahua? Because Chihuahuas come from Mexico, specifically from the state of Chihuahua. They're one of the few dog breeds that originated in Mexico. But reducing Mexican identity to a small dog felt reductive, simplistic. Mexico has a rich history, complex culture, incredible diversity. And Taco Bell chose to represent all of that with a tiny dog that spoke in a caricatured accent. The accent itself was controversial. The Chihuahua spoke English with an exaggerated Spanish accent, pronouncing words in ways that were meant to sound funny. For some Mexican Americans, this felt like mockery. It reminded them of decades of media representation where Mexican characters were buffoons, comic relief, not fully realized people. The Chihuahua was cute, sure, but it was also playing into stereotypes that had been used to diminish and marginalize Mexican people for generations. There were protests. Mexican-American advocacy groups spoke out against the campaign. They argued that it perpetuated negative stereotypes, that it reduced Mexican culture to a joke. Taco Bell responded that the dog was beloved, that people enjoyed the commercials, that no harm was intended. The disconnect between those two positions revealed something fundamental. What seemed harmless and fun to mainstream America felt very different to the people whose culture was being represented. The Chihuahua also represented a particular kind of cultural appropriation. Taco Bell had taken a Mexican dog breed, given it a caricatured Mexican accent, and used it to sell Americanized Mexican food created by a white businessman. Every element of the campaign involved taking something from Mexican culture and using it for profit without meaningful acknowledgement or compensation. The Chihuahua became a symbol of that extraction. But the campaign continued for years because it worked. The Chihuahua sold tacos. Millions of Americans thought the dog was adorable and funny. They didn't see stereotypes. They saw a cute animal in clever commercials. The gap between how the campaign was received by mainstream audiences versus Mexican-American communities illustrated how differently people experience representation when it's their culture being portrayed versus someone else's. The Chihuahua also became part of how Americans understood Mexican identity, at least in a superficial way. The dog reinforced the idea that Mexican culture was cute, harmless, accessible. It wasn't threatening or complex or challenging. It was a little dog that wanted tacos. That simplification was dangerous in its own way. It suggested that Mexican culture existed primarily for American consumption and entertainment. Eventually, the campaign ended. The Chihuahua disappeared from commercials in the early 2000s. Taco Bell moved on to other marketing strategies. But the impact lingered. For years afterward, people still associated Taco Bell with that little dog. The catchphrase remained in the cultural vocabulary. And the conversation about representation, about who gets to tell whose story, about how corporations use culture for profit, continued. The Chihuahua had sold a lot of tacos, but it had also exposed something uncomfortable about how America consumes culture along with food. Here's what was actually in a Taco Bell taco in the 1980s. The meat was a blend of ground beef and something called taco seasoning mix, shipped in bulk from a factory. The cheese was pre-shredded, processed, shipped in plastic bags. The lettuce was iceberg, chopped and bagged. The tortillas were fried days earlier, stored in stacks, reheated as needed. The sauce came from a dispenser. Nothing was made fresh. Nothing was made to order in the way a traditional taqueria would make it. And that was the point. Consistency required control. Every ingredient had to be identical, shelf-stable, easy to store and prepare. It was food engineered for franchising, not flavor. And yet somehow, it still tasted good. That's the strange magic of it. The ground beef arrived at Taco Bell locations in plastic bags, pre-cooked and pre-seasoned. The seasoning mix was proprietary, developed in test kitchens and manufactured at scale. It contained chili powder, cumin, salt, sugar, and various preservatives and anti-caking agents. The beef itself was commodity grade, the cheapest available that still met minimal quality standards. It was cooked at a central facility, cooled, bagged, and shipped to individual restaurants where it was reheated in bags, submerged in hot water. This approach had obvious advantages. Labor costs were minimal. You didn't need a cook who knew how to season meat. You just needed someone who could open a bag and pour it into a steam table. The seasoning was always identical. The texture was always the same. There were no variations, no bad batches, no off days. The system was foolproof. The cheese situation was similar. Pre-shredded cheddar arrived in plastic bags, treated with cellulose powder to prevent clumping. This powder, made from wood pulp, kept the cheese from sticking together, but also meant it didn't melt quite the way fresh cheese would. It stayed grainy, slightly separate. But it was consistent. Every handful contained the same amount. Every taco got the same coverage. The lettuce was even simpler. Iceberg lettuce, the cheapest and most shelf-stable variety, was chopped at a processing facility, washed, bagged, and shipped. It arrived ready to use. No washing, no chopping, no preparation needed. Just open the bag and grab a handful. Iceberg was chosen not for flavor, but for practicality. It stayed crisp longer than other varieties. It didn't wilt quickly. It was crunchy, which added texture to the taco, even if it added almost no flavor. The tortilla shells were the most processed element. They were made at specialized facilities that could produce thousands per hour. Corn flour, water, and oil were mixed into dough, pressed into circles, partially cooked, shaped into U-shapes while still hot and pliable, then fried until crispy. The fried shells were cooled, stacked, packaged, and shipped. At the restaurant, they sat in bins, sometimes for days, waiting to be filled. Before service, they were briefly reheated to restore some crispness, though they were never as crunchy as fresh fried shells would be. The sauce was perhaps the most engineered component. Taco Bell's mild sauce was a blend of tomato paste, water, vinegar, salt, sugar, and spices. It was manufactured in large batches at centralized facilities, tested for consistency, bottled or bagged, and distributed. At restaurants, it was loaded into dispensers that allowed employees to add precisely measured amounts with a squeeze. No judgment required, no variation possible. This industrialization of food was both impressive and depressing. Impressive because the logistics required to deliver identical ingredients to thousands of locations across the country were complex and sophisticated. The supply chain management, the quality control, the distribution networks, all of it required serious engineering and coordination. Taco Bell had figured out how to mass-produce Mexican-flavored food with the efficiency of an automobile assembly line. Depressing because it represented the complete removal of craft from cooking. Traditional Mexican food, like most traditional cuisines, involves judgment and skill. You taste as you cook. You adjust seasoning. You know when meat is properly browned by how it looks and smells. You can tell if a tortilla is ready by touch. That knowledge takes years to develop. It connects you to the food, to the ingredients, to the tradition. Taco Bell removed all of that. The ingredients arrived pre-prepared. The measurements were predetermined. The timing was specified. An employee could work at Taco Bell for years and never actually learn to cook. They learned to assemble, to follow procedures, to execute a system, but not to cook. Yet somehow, despite all this processing, despite all the engineering and cost-cutting and removal of craft, the food tasted good. Not great, not authentic, but good enough. The combination of salt, fat, and texture hit familiar pleasure centers. The seasoning, however simplified, provided enough flavor to be satisfying. The crunch of the shell, the warmth of the meat, the coolness of the lettuce and sour cream, all of it worked together in a way that was genuinely enjoyable. That's what made Taco Bell's industrial approach successful. They'd figured out how to engineer pleasure at scale. The food wasn't made with love or tradition or care. It was made with precision and efficiency and cost control. But it still delivered satisfaction. It still made people happy. It still tasted like something worth eating, even if it bore almost no resemblance to the food that had inspired it. The ingredients that came from factories built an empire. They enabled massive expansion, consistent profits, and reliable customer experiences. They also represented a fundamental transformation in how Americans understood food. Freshness became optional. Craft became unnecessary. What mattered was consistency, convenience, and cost. Taco Bell perfected that formula, and millions of Americans happily ate the results, factory-made and all. Nobody called it cultural appropriation in 1975. That language didn't exist yet, at least not in mainstream conversation. But the tension was there. Mexican-American activists and community leaders were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Why was a white man getting rich off Mexican food while Mexican families struggled to keep their restaurants afloat? Why was Taco Bell everywhere while authentic taquerias remained invisible to most Americans? Why did the dominant narrative about Mexican food come from a corporation in Irvine, California, instead of from the people who actually created it? These questions didn't have easy answers. They still don't. The 1970s saw the rise of the Chicano movement, a civil rights movement focused on Mexican-American identity, pride, and political power. Part of that movement involved reclaiming cultural narratives that had been controlled or distorted by mainstream American institutions. Food was part of that conversation. Who gets to define what Mexican food is? Who profits from it? Whose stories get told? Taco Bell represented everything the movement was pushing back against. Here was a white-owned corporation selling a simplified version of Mexican food to white suburban America, while Mexican-owned restaurants struggled for recognition and resources. The asymmetry was obvious. Taco Bell had access to capital, to marketing budgets, to distribution networks. Mexican-American restaurant owners had none of that. They had tradition, knowledge, and pride. But those things didn't translate into economic power in the way Taco Bell's franchise model did. Some activists organized boycotts. They urged Mexican Americans not to work at Taco Bell, not to eat there, to support authentic restaurants instead. The boycotts had limited impact. Taco Bell was too big, too convenient, too cheap. And many Mexican Americans needed the jobs Taco Bell offered, even if they were low wage and had nothing to do with actual Mexican cooking. The tension also played out in media and academic circles. Scholars began studying how ethnic cuisines were adapted and commodified in America. They documented the pattern. Immigrant communities create food traditions. those traditions get simplified and commercialized by mainstream entrepreneurs. The profits flow away from the originators. It had happened with Chinese food, Italian food, and now it was happening with Mexican food. But the conversation was complicated because not everyone agreed on what constituted harm. Some Mexican Americans argued that Taco Bell, for all its problems, had made Mexican flavors mainstream. It had created curiosity and familiarity. It had paved the way for authentic restaurants to succeed because people were no longer intimidated by Mexican food. Taco Bell had done the work of introduction, however clumsily. Others rejected that argument entirely. They said Taco Bell had actually made things harder for authentic restaurants by setting false expectations. Customers came to Mexican restaurants expecting Taco Bell flavors and were disappointed when they got something different. They complained that the food was too spicy, too complex, too unfamiliar. Taco Bell had trained Americans to expect a specific flavor profile that had nothing to do with real Mexican food. The economic questions were even thornier. Glenn Bell had built a fortune by adapting Mexican food. That fortune came from Mexican culture, Mexican techniques, Mexican ingredients. But Glenn Bell was white. The wealth he generated stayed mostly within white business communities. Mexican Americans who'd been making the food for generations saw none of that wealth. That felt like theft, even if it was technically legal. There was also the issue of representation. When Americans thought about Mexican food, they thought about Taco Bell. Not about the diverse regional cuisines of Mexico. Not about the families and communities that had been preserving these traditions. They thought about hard-shell tacos and mild sauce and drive-through windows. Taco Bell had become the face of Mexican food in America, and that face bore little resemblance to reality. The cultural appropriation framework that would emerge in later decades provided language for these concerns. It distinguished between appreciation and appropriation. Appreciation involves learning about a culture, honoring its origins, supporting its communities. Appropriation involves taking elements of a culture, usually for profit, without acknowledgement or reciprocity. Taco Bell looked a lot like appropriation, but even that framework had limitations. Food has always traveled and changed. Cuisines have always been adapted by different cultures. The question isn't whether adaptation happens, but how it happens and who benefits. When Italian immigrants adapted their food for American tastes, they controlled that adaptation. They owned the restaurants. They told their own stories. When Taco Bell adapted Mexican food, the adaptation was controlled by people outside the culture. The profits went elsewhere. The narrative was shaped by corporate marketing rather than cultural authenticity. These questions persisted through the decades. In the 1990s and 2000s, as conversations about cultural appropriation became more mainstream, Taco Bell found itself regularly criticized. The company mostly ignored the criticism. Their customer base didn't care about authenticity or cultural sensitivity. They cared about cheap, tasty food. Taco Bell kept growing. But the conversation itself mattered. It forced Americans to think about food as more than just sustenance or entertainment. It connected food to identity, history, power. It asked who gets to tell cultural stories and who profits from them. It challenged the assumption that borrowing from other cultures was always innocent or beneficial. These questions didn't stop Taco Bell's expansion, but they changed how some people understood what they were eating when they ordered a crunchy taco supreme. By the early 1990s, something remarkable happened. Salsa outsold ketchup in America for the first time. It was a cultural shift, a sign that American palates were changing, that people were hungry for bolder flavors. Taco Bell played a role in that. Like it or not, the chain had introduced millions of Americans to cumin, cilantro, jalapenos. It wasn't authentic, but it was a gateway. Some people stopped at Taco Bell. Others kept exploring, finding their way to real Mexican restaurants, food trucks, home cooks who'd been making the real thing all along. Taco Bell opened the door. It just didn't tell people there was a whole other room on the other side. The statistic appeared in 1992, reported by trade publications and picked up by mainstream media. Salsa had overtaken ketchup as America's top-selling condiment. It seemed impossible. Ketchup had been the default American condiment for decades. It went on burgers, fries, meatloaf, eggs. It was as American as baseball. But here was salsa, a Mexican condiment, outselling it. The shift reflected real changes in American demographics and tastes. The Latino population in America was growing rapidly. Immigration from Mexico and Central America had increased significantly since the 1960s. These communities brought their food traditions with them, and those traditions were beginning to influence mainstream American eating habits. But it wasn't just Latino Americans buying salsa. White, black, and Asian Americans were buying it too. Salsa had crossed over. It had become a mainstream product, available in every supermarket, often in multiple varieties: mild, medium, hot, chunky, smooth, restaurant style, fresh style. The proliferation of options suggested that Americans weren't just tolerating salsa, they were embracing it. Taco Bell deserved some credit for this shift, however uncomfortable that acknowledgement might be. The chain had spent decades exposing Americans to Mexican-influenced flavors. Those little packets of mild sauce, dispensed by the handful at every Taco Bell, had conditioned millions of people to expect and enjoy those flavors. The sauce wasn't authentic salsa. It was too sweet, too mild, too uniform. But it was close enough to create familiarity. That familiarity reduced the barrier to trying real salsa. When supermarkets started stocking jarred salsa in the 1980s, many Americans were already comfortable with the basic flavor profile. They'd had something similar at Taco Bell. They were willing to try the jarred version. And when they tried it, many discovered they liked it. Real salsa, even the Americanized jarred versions, had more complexity than Taco Bell sauce. It had chunks of tomato and onion. It had varying levels of heat. It had texture. The salsa moment also reflected Americans' increasing desire for bold flavors. The 1980s and 90s saw an explosion of interest in spicy food, ethnic cuisines, and ingredients that weren't traditional to American cooking. Part of this was demographic change. Part was increased travel and cultural exchange. Part was pure boredom with bland American food. Taco Bell had helped create that boredom, ironically. By making Mexican-ish food so accessible and common, it had normalized those flavors. What had seemed exotic in the 1960s felt routine by the 1990s. Americans wanted something more. They wanted actual heat. They wanted complexity. They wanted authenticity, or at least something closer to it. This created an opening for authentic Mexican restaurants and products. Mexican grocery stores started appearing in more neighborhoods. Mexican ingredients became available in mainstream supermarkets. Cookbooks about real Mexican food started selling. Americans who'd grown up eating Taco Bell were now adults seeking out the food that Taco Bell had been imitating. The salsa outselling ketchup moment was symbolic. It suggested that America was becoming more comfortable with Mexican culture, or at least with Mexican food. But the reality was more complicated. Salsa had succeeded partly by becoming less Mexican. The jarred salsas that dominated sales were milder and sweeter than traditional salsas. They were made for American palates. They were salsa in the same way that Taco Bell was Mexican food. A simplified, Americanized version that retained some flavor characteristics while removing most of the cultural context. Still, the shift mattered. It created opportunities. Mexican restaurants could now open in places where they never would have survived before. Food trucks serving real tacos could find customers who actually appreciated what they were eating. Mexican ingredients and cooking techniques became more valued and understood. Taco Bell had helped create the conditions for this shift, even if it wasn't Taco Bell's intention. The salsa moment also highlighted a pattern in American food culture. We adopt ethnic foods in stages. First comes the simplified, Americanized version, stripped of anything too challenging. Then comes growing familiarity and comfort. Then comes curiosity about the real thing. Then comes deeper appreciation and understanding. Taco Bell represented the first stage. The salsa moment represented the beginning of the third stage. But not everyone made that journey. Millions of Americans still thought Taco Bell sauce was salsa. They still thought hard-shell tacos were authentic. They'd been introduced to Mexican flavors, but never moved beyond that introduction. Taco Bell had opened the door, as the metaphor goes, but many people never walked through it. They stayed in the doorway, comfortable with the simplified version, unaware or uninterested in what lay beyond. Let's be honest. By the 1980s, Taco Bell had become something specific in American culture. Drunk food. The place you went after the bars closed. The thing you craved at 2 a.m. when nothing else was open and your judgment was impaired just enough to make a burrito supreme feel like the best decision you'd ever made. It wasn't fine dining. It wasn't trying to be. It was cheap, open late, and engineered to taste good under very specific circumstances. And that became part of its identity. Taco Bell didn't just sell tacos. It sold a kind of chaotic, late-night comfort that had nothing to do with Mexico and everything to do with American excess. The Drunk Food Association wasn't planned. It emerged organically from the intersection of Taco Bell's business model and American drinking culture. Taco Bell locations stayed open late, often until 2 or 3 a.m, because the late-night hours were profitable. You didn't need much staff. The customers who came through were hungry and impulsive. They ordered a lot and didn't complain about quality. College towns were where the pattern became most obvious. Near universities, Taco Bells became essential infrastructure for student life. Thursday through Saturday nights, the drive-through lines stretched around the block. Students stumbled in after parties, after bars, after whatever chaos had defined their evening. They were drunk, high, or some combination thereof. They had cash in their pockets and a desperate need for something salty and filling. Taco Bell was perfect for this moment. The food was cheap enough that drunk college students could afford it. The menu was simple enough that impaired brains could navigate it. The food arrived quickly enough that short attention spans didn't wander. And most importantly, the food tasted incredible when you were drunk. The salt, the fat, the texture. All of it hit differently at 2 a.m. with alcohol in your system. There was something almost chemical about it. Alcohol lowers blood sugar and depletes electrolytes. Your body craves salt and calories. Taco Bell provided both in abundance. The seasoned meat was salty. The cheese was salty. The sauce added even more sodium. A single trip to Taco Bell could deliver 2,000 milligrams of sodium and 1,500 calories. For a drunk person, that felt like exactly what the body needed. The experience also had a particular aesthetic. Drunk people eating Taco Bell in their cars, sauce dripping onto their laps, napkins everywhere, completely absorbed in the moment of consumption. It wasn't dignified. It wasn't pretty. But it was authentic in a way that few other experiences are. In those moments, people weren't performing or pretending. They were just satisfying a craving with the most efficient means available. Taco Bell leaned into this identity, though never officially. The company couldn't openly market itself as drunk food. That would have been irresponsible, possibly legally problematic. But they understood their late-night customer base. They kept locations open. They staffed the late-night shifts. They created menu items that seemed designed for impaired judgment. The volcano burrito, the XXL chalupa, things that were excessive and absurd and perfect for 2 in the morning. The drunk food phenomenon also created a kind of collective memory. Almost everyone who went to college in America between 1980 and 2010 has a Taco Bell story. The time they ordered 30 tacos for 3 people. The time they ate in the parking lot and watched the sunrise. The time they were so drunk they couldn't remember ordering, but woke up surrounded by Taco Bell wrappers. These stories became part of the shared cultural narrative around Taco Bell. But the Drunk Food Association also limited how Taco Bell was perceived. It was hard to take seriously as a restaurant when everyone associated it with poor decision-making and impaired judgment. The food was explicitly not something you ate when you were at your best. It was something you ate when you were at your worst, or at least at your most uninhibited. This created a paradox. Taco Bell was wildly successful, profitable, growing constantly, but it also had low cultural status. No one bragged about eating at Taco Bell. No one took a date there unless it was ironic. The brand was popular, but not prestigious, familiar, but not respected. That Drunk Food Association explained much of that dynamic. The phenomenon also reinforced the distance between Taco Bell and authentic Mexican food. Mexican cuisine, real Mexican cuisine, is sophisticated and varied. It includes fine dining establishments where chefs train for years to perfect complex techniques. It includes street food that's simple but made with incredible care and skill. It's food that deserves respect and appreciation. Taco Bell was none of that. It was drunk food. It was the thing you ate when you couldn't taste properly anyway. That association made it even harder for Americans to understand that Mexican food could be something worthy of serious attention. If Taco Bell was their reference point for Mexican food and Taco Bell was drunk food, then Mexican food was drunk food. The logic was flawed, but the association stuck. Yet there was also something democratizing about the drunk food phenomenon. Taco Bell didn't judge. It didn't care if you were sober or drunk, making good choices or terrible ones. It was there, open, ready to feed you. That non-judgmental availability created a strange kind of intimacy. People had vulnerable moments at Taco Bell, moments when their guard was down and their needs were simple. The chain became associated with a particular kind of acceptance, a willingness to meet people where they were, even if where they were was drunk in a drive-thru at 3 in the morning. Behind every Taco Bell counter were teenagers and young adults, many of them Mexican-American, earning minimum wage to assemble a version of their own culture for customers who had no idea what the real thing tasted like. That irony wasn't lost on anyone. You'd have kids whose grandmothers made tamales from scratch, spending their shifts folding pre-made tortillas around factory-seasoned beef. It was work. It was money. But it was also strange, this loop of cultural production where the people closest to the authentic tradition were the ones serving the imitation. Maria started working at Taco Bell in 1983 when she was 16. She needed the money. Her family had immigrated from Jalisco when she was 10. Her parents worked in agriculture, hard physical labor that paid barely enough to survive. Maria's job at Taco Bell was easier, at least physically. She stood behind a counter, assembled tacos according to a precise system, took orders, cleaned. The work was repetitive, but not backbreaking. The strange part was the food. At home, her mother made tortillas by hand every morning. She slow-cooked carnitas in a heavy pot until the meat fell apart. She made salsas by roasting chilies and tomatoes on a comal, grinding them with garlic and salt. The food took time and care. It connected them to home, to family, to who they were. At Taco Bell, Maria opened bags of pre-cooked meat. She grabbed handfuls of pre-shredded cheese. She squeezed sauce from a dispenser. She assembled tacos in 15 seconds. The food bore no resemblance to what her mother made, but customers loved it. They lined up for it. They called it Mexican food. Maria's experience was common among Mexican-American Taco Bell workers. They existed in a strange space, intimately familiar with authentic food traditions, while spending their days producing something that mocked those traditions. Some found it funny. Some found it depressing. Most just found it practical. It was a job. It paid. That was what mattered. The work itself was designed to require no skill. Taco Bell had engineered the system so that anyone could be trained in a few hours. You didn't need cooking knowledge. You didn't need to understand flavors or techniques. You just needed to follow instructions. Open this bag. Add this much meat. Fold like this. The system was foolproof because it had to be. Taco Bell couldn't rely on finding skilled workers at minimum wage. This de-skilling of food preparation had broader implications. It meant that young people could work at Taco Bell for years and never learn to cook. They learned to assemble, to follow procedures, but not to cook. They didn't develop the judgment and intuition that cooking requires. They became cogs in a system rather than craftspeople developing a skill. For Mexican-American workers specifically, this was complicated. Many had grown up in households where cooking was a valued skill, where knowledge of traditional techniques was passed down through generations. Working at Taco Bell didn't connect them to that tradition. If anything, it separated them from it. They were participating in the commercialization and simplification of their own culture. The wages were another issue. Taco Bell paid minimum wage, often the absolute minimum legally required. In the 1980s, that meant $3 or $4 an hour. Workers could spend an entire shift making hundreds of tacos, generating thousands of dollars in sales for the company, and take home maybe $30. The math didn't favor labor. Taco Bell, like most fast food chains, also resisted unionization efforts. Workers who tried to organize for better wages or conditions were often fired. The company maintained that fast food jobs were entry-level positions, temporary work for teenagers, not careers that deserved living wages. Never mind that many workers were adults supporting families, or that they stayed in these jobs for years because better options weren't available. The working conditions could be harsh. Fast food kitchens are hot, greasy, loud. The work is repetitive and physically demanding in ways that aren't always obvious. Standing in the same spot for 8 hours, making the same motions hundreds of times, takes a toll on the body. Burns from hot oil were common. Cuts from sharp edges, slips on greasy floors. These weren't glamorous injuries, and they rarely resulted in workers' compensation claims because no one wanted to risk losing their job. But the workers kept showing up. They needed the money. They needed the flexible hours that allowed them to work around school or other jobs. They needed something on their resume, even if it was just fast food. For many young Mexican Americans, Taco Bell was their introduction to the American workforce. It taught them about hierarchy, about following rules, about showing up on time. It also taught them that their labor was undervalued and their culture was a commodity. Some workers took pride in their work despite everything. They learned to make perfect tacos, to keep their station clean, to serve customers efficiently. That pride wasn't about Taco Bell specifically. It was about personal standards, about doing any job well regardless of what the job was. But it still felt strange to take pride in assembling mass-produced approximations of your grandmother's food. The irony of Mexican Americans serving Americanized Mexican food to white customers wasn't lost on anyone involved. It was a small but perfect example of how power and culture interact in America. The people with the most knowledge about authentic Mexican food were the lowest paid workers in a system that profited from simplifying and selling that food. The people with the least knowledge were the customers and the owners. That inversion, that upside-down relationship between knowledge and power, defined much of the Taco Bell experience. In the 2000s, Taco Bell tried something different. They tested upscale locations with darker lighting, actual plates instead of wrappers, margaritas. They wanted to shake the fast food image, to compete with places like Chipotle that were selling a more premium version of Americanized Mexican food. It didn't really work. People didn't want fancy Taco Bell. They wanted cheap Taco Bell. They wanted the thing that had always been there, reliable and unpretentious, and exactly the same as it was 20 years ago. The upscale experiment quietly faded. Taco Bell went back to what it did best, being unapologetically itself. The first upscale Taco Bell opened in 2005 in a trendy neighborhood in Southern California. The design was completely different from standard locations. Dark wood instead of bright plastic, Edison bulbs instead of fluorescent lights, an actual bar serving margaritas and Mexican beer. The menu was expanded to include items with ingredients like pico de gallo and cilantro lime rice. Prices were higher. The experience was meant to feel like a real restaurant, not a fast food joint. The thinking behind this experiment made sense on paper. Chipotle had proven that Americans would pay more for Mexican food if it felt higher quality. Chipotle served their food on real plates, used words like artisanal and sustainable, created an atmosphere that felt clean and modern. They were taking the same basic concept as Taco Bell, burritos and tacos, and positioning it as something worth paying more for. Taco Bell wanted a piece of that market. They wanted to attract customers who'd aged out of drunk Taco Bell runs but still had nostalgia for the brand. They wanted to compete in the fast casual space where margins were better and customers were willing to pay premium prices. The upscale locations were designed to test whether Taco Bell could make that leap. The problem was identity. Taco Bell had spent decades building a brand around cheap, fast, unpretentious food. That brand was incredibly strong. People knew exactly what Taco Bell was. How, when they went there, they expected paper wrappers and fluorescent lights, and food that cost a couple dollars. They didn't expect atmosphere or presentation or margaritas. The upscale locations confused people. Customers would come in expecting normal Taco Bell and be put off by the higher prices and different format. They didn't want to sit down and wait for their food. They wanted to order at a counter and eat in their car. The whole point of Taco Bell, for most customers, was that it didn't require any ceremony or commitment. You could get in and out in 5 minutes. The upscale locations required more time, more engagement, more money. The food itself was only marginally different. It had some upgrades, better ingredients here and there, but it was still fundamentally Taco Bell. You couldn't disguise that. The DNA of the food, the basic flavor profile and format, was too distinctive. Serving it on a plate instead of in a wrapper didn't make it a different experience. It just made it slower and more expensive. The margaritas were particularly strange. Taco Bell had no expertise in bar service. They were a fast food chain. Adding alcohol required licensing, training, monitoring. It introduced complexity into a business model built on simplicity. And the margaritas themselves were mediocre, made from mixes, nothing that would justify the upscale branding. The experiment also revealed something about customer loyalty. People who loved Taco Bell loved it for what it was, not what it could become. They didn't want Taco Bell to grow up or get fancy. They wanted it to stay exactly the same as it had always been. That consistency was the whole appeal. You could leave town for 10 years, come back, and Taco Bell would be exactly the same. That reliability was comforting. The upscale location struggled to find an audience. They were too expensive for regular Taco Bell customers and not authentic enough for people seeking real Mexican food. They existed in an awkward middle space, appealing to no one in particular. Some locations closed within a year. Others limped along for a while before being converted back to standard format. The failure taught Taco Bell an important lesson about brand identity. You can't be everything to everyone. You have to choose what you are and commit to it. Taco Bell was cheap fast food with Mexican flavors. That's what customers wanted. Trying to be something else, something more upscale or sophisticated, just confused people and diluted the brand. There was also something revealing about what the upscale experiment said about Taco Bell's relationship to Mexican food. Even when trying to be more premium, Taco Bell didn't move toward authenticity. They didn't hire Mexican chefs or introduce traditional recipes or try to educate customers about real Mexican cuisine. They just added darker lighting and charged more money. The food remained fundamentally the same. This suggested that Taco Bell understood, perhaps unconsciously, that their food had nothing to do with Mexican cuisine anymore. It was its own category. Trying to make it more Mexican, more authentic, would have required admitting that it wasn't authentic to begin with. That admission would have undermined decades of marketing and brand building. So Taco Bell retreated. They closed or converted the upscale locations. They went back to bright lights and paper wrappers and dollar menu items. They embraced what they'd always been: cheap, fast, reliably mediocre. And customers appreciated that honesty. They didn't want fancy Taco Bell. They wanted Taco Bell to be Taco Bell. In a world where everything was constantly changing and trying to be something it wasn't, there was comfort in a brand that stayed exactly the same, unapologetically itself, for better or worse. In 2012, Taco Bell introduced the Doritos Locos Taco, a taco shell made from a giant Dorito. It was absurd. It was brilliant. It was the least authentic thing anyone had ever called a taco. And it became one of the best-selling items in fast food history. Over 1 billion sold in the first year. People waited in line for it. They posted about it online. They treated it like an event. It was a reminder that Taco Bell had never been about authenticity. It was about innovation within its own strange universe. And in that universe, a neon orange taco shell made perfect sense. The Doritos Locos Taco represented the culmination of everything Taco Bell had become. It was a product designed by committee, test-marketed extensively, engineered to maximize appeal and profit. It had nothing to do with Mexican food. It was pure American invention, the collision of two junk food brands creating something new and completely artificial. The development took 3 years. Taco Bell's food scientists had to figure out how to make a taco shell that tasted like Doritos, had the right texture, and could survive the supply chain from factory to restaurant without falling apart. They went through hundreds of prototypes. They tested different chip thicknesses, different seasoning applications, different packaging methods. The final product was an engineering achievement, however ridiculous. The shell tasted exactly like nacho cheese Doritos. That artificial cheese flavor, that particular orange dust that sticks to your fingers, was embedded in the shell. When you bit into the taco, you got the familiar Doritos experience, plus the filling of seasoned beef, lettuce, and cheese. It was sensory overload in the best possible way if you like that kind of thing. The marketing campaign was massive. Taco Bell knew they had something special. They teased the product for weeks before launch, building anticipation. Social media exploded with speculation and excitement. Food bloggers wrote countdown posts. The launch felt like a cultural event, not just a menu addition. When the Doritos Locos Taco finally became available, The lines were absurd. Drive-thrus backed up into the street. Locations sold out within hours. Taco Bell had to ramp up production faster than planned. The demand exceeded every projection. In the first year, they sold over 1 billion Doritos Locos Tacos. That's roughly 3 tacos for every person in America. The success revealed something about American food culture in the 21st century. Authenticity didn't matter. Tradition didn't matter. What mattered was novelty, excitement, the shareable moment. The Doritos Locos Taco was perfect for Instagram, for Twitter, for the kind of food culture that valued experience over substance. It was weird enough to be interesting, but familiar enough to be approachable. The product also represented peak mashup culture. The 2000s and 2010s saw an explosion of food mashups: the cronut, the ramen burger, sushi burritos. These hybrid foods got media attention and drove sales. They were designed to be talked about, photographed, shared. The Doritos Locos Taco fit perfectly into this trend. But the taco also highlighted the vast distance between Taco Bell and authentic Mexican food. No one could pretend this was Mexican cuisine. It was American junk food, explicitly and unapologetically. The Doritos Locos Taco didn't claim any connection to Mexican tradition. It was just 2 American brands collaborating to create something new. That honesty, that complete abandonment of any pretense to authenticity, was almost refreshing. Taco Bell had spent decades walking a line between claiming to serve Mexican food and doing whatever was profitable. The Doritos Locos Taco abandoned that pretense entirely. This wasn't Mexican food. This was Taco Bell food. Its own category, its own rules. The product also worked because it understood its audience perfectly. Taco Bell's core customers weren't looking for authentic Mexican cuisine. They were looking for cheap, tasty, fun food. They wanted something that tasted good and made them feel like they were participating in something culturally relevant. The Doritos Locos Taco delivered all of that. The success led to more collaborations. Cool Ranch Doritos Locos Tacos. Fiery Doritos Locos Tacos. Each new variation generated media attention and sales. Taco Bell had found a formula that worked. Take a familiar product, add a twist that's weird enough to be newsworthy but not so weird that it's off-putting, market it heavily, and watch people line up. The Doritos Locos Taco also proved that Taco Bell's business model was still viable in the 21st century. Fast food was facing increasing competition from fast casual chains that positioned themselves as healthier, higher quality, more ethical. Chipotle, Panera, Sweetgreen, all were eating into traditional fast food's market share. But Taco Bell found success by going in the opposite direction. Instead of trying to compete on health or quality, they doubled down on fun, novelty, and unapologetic junk food. That strategy worked because there was still a market for cheap, convenient, indulgent food. Not everyone wanted to eat kale salads and quinoa bowls. Some people just wanted a taco made from a giant Dorito. And Taco Bell was happy to serve them. The product also became a symbol of generational divides in food culture. Older Americans were often horrified by the Doritos Locos Taco. It represented everything wrong with modern food: artificial, overprocessed, divorced from any culinary tradition. Younger Americans saw it as genius, a playful innovation that didn't take itself too seriously. That generational split said something about changing values and priorities around food. So here's the question that hangs over all of this. Did Glenn Bell respect Mexican culture, or did he just see an opportunity? Did Taco Bell introduce people to Mexican food, or did it bury the real thing under layers of marketing and convenience? Is it possible for a corporation to honor a tradition while also simplifying it beyond recognition? These aren't easy questions. Respect is complicated. Appreciation and appropriation live close together, and the line between them shifts depending on who you ask. What's certain is that Taco Bell changed American food culture. Whether that change was good or bad depends on where you're standing. Respect implies relationship. It implies recognizing the value and dignity of something beyond your own needs. It means honoring origins, acknowledging debt, ensuring that the people who created something benefit when it's commercialized. By that standard, it's hard to argue that Glenn Bell or Taco Bell showed respect to Mexican culture. Glenn Bell learned from the Montoyas and built a fortune on that knowledge. The Montoyas stayed small. There's no evidence that Glenn Bell ever publicly acknowledged his debt to them or to Mexican cuisine more broadly. The story Taco Bell told about itself was one of entrepreneurial genius, not cultural borrowing. Glenn Bell was positioned as the creator, the innovator, the visionary. The Mexican families who'd been making tacos for generations were written out of the narrative. Taco Bell's approach to Mexican food was extractive. They took what was useful, the basic flavors and formats, and discarded everything else. The regional diversity of Mexican cuisine, the techniques that took years to master, the cultural significance of specific dishes, none of that interested them. They wanted what could be systematized and scaled. Everything else was irrelevant. That extraction happened without meaningful engagement with Mexican communities. Taco Bell didn't hire Mexican chefs to develop their menu. They didn't partner with Mexican suppliers. They didn't donate to Mexican cultural organizations or support Mexican-American communities. The relationship was entirely one-directional. They took from Mexican culture and gave nothing back. But there's a counter-argument that's worth considering. Taco Bell introduced millions of Americans to Mexican-influenced flavors. For many people, Taco Bell was their first exposure to cumin, cilantro, jalapenos. That exposure created familiarity and comfort. Some percentage of those people became curious enough to seek out authentic Mexican food. They started going to real taquerias, trying new dishes, appreciating the cuisine beyond Taco Bell's simplified version. If Taco Bell served as a gateway, however imperfect, did it ultimately benefit Mexican food culture in America? That's debatable. Some Mexican restaurant owners credit Taco Bell with making Mexican food mainstream, with creating an environment where authentic restaurants could succeed. Others argue that Taco Bell made their jobs harder by setting false expectations and teaching Americans to expect cheap, mild, fast Mexican food. The respect question also depends on intent. Did Glenn Bell set out to honor Mexican cuisine, or was he just trying to make money? The answer seems obvious. He was an entrepreneur looking for opportunity. He saw a market gap and filled it. The fact that he was borrowing from Mexican culture was incidental to his real goal, which was building a profitable business. But does intent matter? If the impact is cultural appropriation and extraction, does it matter whether that was Glenn Bell's intention? Probably not to the people whose culture was being appropriated. The impact is what matters. And the impact was that a white businessman got rich selling simplified Mexican food while Mexican families struggled. There's also the question of whether corporations can ever truly respect culture. Corporations exist to maximize profit for shareholders. That's their legal obligation. Everything else is secondary. Cultural respect, authenticity, tradition, these things only matter to a corporation if they're profitable. Taco Bell simplified Mexican food not because they were disrespectful, but because simplification increased profits. If respecting tradition had been more profitable, they would have done that instead. This reveals something fundamental about capitalism and culture. When culture becomes commodity, the logic of profit takes over. What matters is what sells, not what's authentic or meaningful. Taco Bell didn't ask whether hard-shell tacos honored Mexican tradition. They asked whether Americans would buy them. That's the question that drove every decision. The respect question is also complicated by the fact that food always changes as it moves between cultures. Italian food in America isn't the same as Italian food in Italy. Chinese food in America isn't the same as Chinese food in China. That's normal. That's how food works. The question isn't whether adaptation happens, but how it happens and who controls it. When Italian and Chinese immigrants adapted their food for America, they controlled that process. They made the changes. They owned the restaurants. They told their own stories. When Mexican food was adapted by Taco Bell, the people making the decisions weren't Mexican. The adaptation was controlled by outsiders. That's what made it appropriation rather than evolution. Maybe the answer is that respect requires reciprocity. It requires acknowledging where things come from and ensuring that the originators benefit. Taco Bell failed on both counts. They rarely acknowledged their debt to Mexican cuisine, and they certainly didn't ensure the Mexican communities benefited from Taco Bell's success. But America's relationship with Mexican food is changing. There's more awareness now of appropriation, more conversation about who profits from culture, more effort to support authentic restaurants and Mexican-owned businesses. That change happened despite Taco Bell, not because of it. The question of respect remains complicated, maybe unanswerable, but it's a question worth asking every time you unwrap a crunchy taco supreme. While Taco Bell was building an empire, Mexican and Mexican-American families continued making the real thing. Tacos with hand-pressed tortillas, salsas made fresh every morning, recipes passed down through generations. They didn't have franchise agreements or national ad campaigns. They had tradition, pride, and flavors that couldn't be replicated in a test kitchen. Some of those families are still there, running taquerias and food trucks, serving food that tastes like home. Taco Bell exists in one reality. These families exist in another. And both are part of the American food landscape now, whether they like it or not. The Garcia family opened their taqueria in San Diego in 1978. 3 generations worked together. The grandmother, who'd learned to make tortillas from her mother in Michoacan. The parents, who'd immigrated in the 60s and worked construction and housekeeping to save money. The children, who grew up bilingual and bicultural, navigating between Mexican tradition and American opportunity. The taqueria served the neighborhood, mostly other Mexican-American families. The menu was simple but authentic. Tacos al pastor with meat cooked on a vertical spit. Pineapple adding sweetness. Carnitas that had been braised for hours until crispy and tender. Barbacoa wrapped in banana leaves and steamed underground on weekends. Tortillas made fresh every hour, still warm when they reached your plate. The food took time. You couldn't rush it. The meat for carnitas started cooking the night before. The salsas were made in the morning. Chilies roasted on a comal until the skin blistered. Everything was prepared with care, because that's how you honored the tradition. That's how you connected to where you came from. The Garcia family watched Taco Bell expand through the 80s and 90s. More locations opening, more customers pouring in, more money being made. Their taquerias stayed small. They made enough to survive, to keep the doors open, to pay themselves modest salaries. But they never expanded. They never franchised. That wasn't what they wanted. They took pride in their food. People came from across the city because word had spread about the quality. Chefs from fancy restaurants would stop by on their days off. Food writers would include them in articles about authentic Mexican food in San Diego. But they never attracted the mainstream crowds that Taco Bell did. Their restaurant felt too authentic, too unfamiliar, too challenging for people raised on hard-shell tacos and mild sauce. This pattern repeated across the country. Mexican families running small restaurants, food trucks, catering businesses, making real food with real techniques, struggling to compete with chains that had every structural advantage: capital, marketing, brand recognition, economies of scale. The families had authenticity, But authenticity didn't pay the rent. Some adapted. They added Americanized items to their menus. They served both the traditional food for their community and simplified versions for white customers who wanted familiar flavors. It was pragmatic, if not ideologically pure. You serve what people will eat. You do what you need to survive. Others refused to compromise. They kept their menus traditional, their techniques authentic. They accepted that their customer base would be smaller. They cooked for people who understood and appreciated what they were doing. They didn't need validation from mainstream America. They had their community, their pride, their traditions. These families kept Mexican food alive in America in ways that Taco Bell never could. They preserved regional variations. They taught their children the old techniques. They maintained connections to home, to heritage, to identity. Food was how they stayed Mexican in a country that constantly pushed them to assimilate. The food trucks that emerged in the 2000s and 2010s represented a new generation of this tradition. Younger Mexican Americans who'd grown up eating both authentic food at home and Taco Bell with friends. They understood both worlds. They could code switch between them. And many chose to honor the authentic tradition, setting up food trucks that served real tacos made with care. These trucks benefited from changing American tastes. By the 2000s, enough Americans had been exposed to Mexican food through Taco Bell and other chains that they were ready for something more authentic. The food truck format also helped. It was approachable, affordable, less intimidating than a sit-down restaurant. People were willing to try unfamiliar tacos from a truck. Some of these food trucks became incredibly successful. They expanded to multiple trucks, opened brick-and-mortar locations, built real businesses. They proved that authentic Mexican food could succeed commercially in America. You didn't have to simplify and Americanize to the degree Taco Bell had. You could stay true to tradition and still build something sustainable. But even this success was complicated. As authentic Mexican food became trendy, gentrification followed. Neighborhoods where Mexican families had lived for generations saw rents increase. The taquerias that had served those communities for decades were pushed out, replaced by upscale restaurants serving expensive versions of street food. The food became fashionable, but the people who'd preserved the traditions often didn't benefit. Still, the families persisted. The Garcias still run their taqueria in San Diego. The grandmother is gone now, but her recipes remain. Her grandchildren make tortillas the way she taught them. They slow-cook carnitas in the same copper pot she used. They honor her memory through food. These families exist as a kind of counterpoint to Taco Bell. They represent what was lost when Mexican food was industrialized and commodified. But they also represent what survived. Despite everything, despite Taco Bell's dominance and mainstream America's acceptance of simplified versions, the real thing persisted. Families kept cooking. Traditions survived. The food remained, in small restaurants and food trucks and home kitchens across America. Taco Bell may have won commercially, but these families won something else. They kept their culture alive. They preserved their heritage. They made food that mattered. And that's a different kind of success. Today, we talk about food differently. We ask where it comes from, who profits, whose story gets told. We use words like appropriation and representation. We care, or at least we say we do, about authenticity. Taco Bell exists in that conversation now, whether it wants to or not. Some people defend it as a gateway, a bridge that brought Mexican flavors to Middle America. Others see it as a cautionary tale about what happens when culture becomes commodity. Both perspectives have merit. The truth is probably somewhere in between, messy and uncomfortable and still evolving. The language around food and culture has changed dramatically, since Glenn Bell opened his first taco stand. In the 1950s and 60s, nobody questioned whether a white businessman should be selling Mexican food. It was just business. America was a melting pot, or so the story went. Cultures mixed, borrowed from each other, created something new. That narrative justified all kinds of extraction and appropriation. Today, the conversation is more nuanced. We understand that not all cultural exchange is equal. There's a difference between immigrants adapting their own cuisine for a new market and outsiders taking a cuisine and profiting from a simplified version of it. That distinction matters. It affects how we evaluate what Glenn Bell did and what Taco Bell became. Social media has amplified these conversations. When Taco Bell releases a new product or campaign, the response is immediate and public. Mexican Americans and others can critique, mock, or call out what they see as appropriation or insensitivity. The company can't control the narrative the way they could in the pre-internet era. Every decision is scrutinized, debated, memed. This scrutiny has made some people defensive about Taco Bell. They argue that it's just food, that people are being too sensitive, that cultural borrowing has always happened and always will. They say they don't care about authenticity. They just want cheap tacos that taste good. And that's valid in a way. Personal preference is personal preference. But the conversation isn't really about individual preferences. It's about power and representation. It's about who gets to tell stories about a culture and who profits from those stories. Taco Bell told a story about Mexican food for decades, and that story shaped how millions of Americans understood Mexican culture. That's power. The people whose culture was being represented had no say in how that story was told. That's the problem. The modern conversation also involves greater awareness of authenticity. Food media has exploded. Shows on Netflix and YouTube introduce viewers to real Mexican cuisine in all its regional diversity. People can learn about Oaxacan mole or Yucatecan cochinita pibil without leaving their living room. That exposure creates context that didn't exist before. People can see the distance between Taco Bell and the real thing. This awareness has created tension. Some people who grew up loving Taco Bell now feel guilty about it. They've learned enough about Mexican food to understand that what they've been eating is a bastardized version. They feel like they were lied to, or at least misled. Others don't care. They accept that Taco Bell isn't authentic and love it anyway, as its own thing. There's also growing recognition of the economic dimensions. The conversation isn't just about representation. It's about who benefits financially when culture is commodified. When celebrity chefs or corporations profit from ethnic cuisines without meaningful engagement with the communities those cuisines come from, that's extraction. When restaurants owned by people from those communities struggle to survive, that's inequity. Some companies have started responding to this awareness. They partner with cultural consultants. They hire chefs from the relevant communities. They donate to cultural organizations. These efforts are sometimes genuine, sometimes performative. But they represent recognition that the old model, where companies could take whatever they wanted from other cultures without consequence, no longer works. Taco Bell has mostly avoided this reckoning. They've never claimed to be authentic. They position themselves as their own category, not as representatives of Mexican cuisine. That's strategically smart. It insulates them from authenticity critiques. If you're not claiming to be authentic, you can't be criticized for being inauthentic. But that position also feels like evasion. Taco Bell uses Mexican ingredients, Mexican words, Mexican cultural imagery. They benefit from the association with Mexican culture. But they want to avoid accountability for how they represent or profit from that culture. That's having it both ways. The modern conversation also includes voices that weren't heard before. Second- and third-generation Mexican Americans who grew up navigating between cultures. food writers and scholars who study the politics of cuisine, activists who connect food justice to broader issues of equity and representation. These voices make the conversation richer and more complex. What's emerging is a more sophisticated understanding of how food, culture, power, and identity intersect. It's not enough to say food is just food. Food carries meaning. It connects people to heritage, to community, to identity. When that food is taken and transformed and sold by outsiders, something is lost. Maybe something is gained too, in terms of exposure and access. But the loss deserves acknowledgement. The Taco Bell conversation continues to evolve. Each generation sees it differently, based on their own experiences and values. For some, it's nostalgia, a connection to childhood and simpler times. For others, it's a symbol of cultural appropriation and corporate exploitation. Both perspectives exist simultaneously in the same country, sometimes in the same person. That tension, that contradiction, is part of what makes the Taco Bell story so revealing about America itself. So here we are, 25 segments later, and the question still hangs in the air like the smell of seasoned beef and fried tortilla shells. Was Taco Bell built for Americans? You already know the answer. Of course it was. It was built for a country that wanted Mexican flavors without Mexican complexity. It was built for suburbs and highways and people eating in their cars. It was built for teenagers working minimum wage jobs and college students stumbling in at 2 a.m. It was built for a version of America that valued speed over tradition, convenience over craft, consistency over authenticity. Glenn Bell watched the Montoyas make tacos and saw opportunity. He took their techniques, simplified them, systematized them, and built an empire. The Montoyas stayed small. Glenn Bell became a millionaire. That asymmetry tells the whole story. Taco Bell introduced millions of Americans to cumin and cilantro and jalapenos, sure. But it also taught them that Mexican food was supposed to be cheap and fast and mild. It created expectations that made authentic Mexican cuisine seem expensive, or challenging, or too different. It opened a door, but didn't tell anyone there were other rooms beyond it. The workers who made it possible were often the same people whose grandmothers made the real thing at home. That irony, that strange loop where Mexican Americans served simplified versions of their own culture to customers who didn't know the difference. That's part of the story, too. The crunchy taco became the template. The hard shell, the ground beef, the shredded cheese, the mild sauce. That became what Americans thought a taco was supposed to be. Not the soft corn tortillas, not the slow-cooked carnitas, not the fresh salsas made every morning. Just the version that could be mass-produced and sold for 70 cents. The Chihuahua sold tacos but reinforced stereotypes. The Doritos Locos Taco broke the internet but had nothing to do with Mexico. The drive-thru made everything faster and more convenient and completely disconnected from any cultural context. Every innovation moved Taco Bell further from its origins and deeper into its own strange category. And through it all, Mexican families kept making the real thing. In small taquerias and food trucks and home kitchens, they preserved traditions that Taco Bell ignored. They made tortillas by hand. They slow-cooked meat for hours. They honored recipes passed down through generations. They didn't get rich, but they kept the culture alive. The controversy around Taco Bell isn't going away because the questions it raises are fundamental. Who gets to profit from culture? Who gets to define what food from a particular culture should taste like? How do we balance accessibility with authenticity? When does borrowing become appropriation? These questions matter beyond Taco Bell. They matter for how we understand food, culture, power, and identity in America. Maybe there's room for both Taco Bell and authentic Mexican food. Maybe they serve different purposes, meet different needs. Maybe you can enjoy a crunchy taco supreme at midnight and still appreciate real mole made with 30 ingredients and 3 days of preparation. Maybe those things don't have to be in conflict, but it's worth knowing the difference. It's worth understanding that Taco Bell was built by taking knowledge from Mexican families and turning it into profit for people outside that community. It's worth recognizing that the convenience and accessibility came at a cost, that something was lost in translation, that the simplified version buried the authentic one for decades. Glenn Bell built something impressive, a franchise system that worked, a brand that endured, a product that millions of people loved. But he built it on a foundation that wasn't entirely his own. He stood on shoulders he never acknowledged. He profited from a culture he never honored. The taste of Taco Bell is real. The nostalgia is real. The memories tied to those cheap tacos eaten in parking lots and dorm rooms and road trips, those are real too. You don't have to feel guilty about enjoying Taco Bell, but you should know what you're eating, where it came from, who profited from it, and what got lost along the way. Today, Taco Bell serves the same food it's always served. The buildings look different. The marketing has changed, but the core product remains unchanged, frozen in 1962, forever serving a version of Mexican food designed for Americans who wanted something different, but not too different. The Montoyas still run Mitla Cafe in San Bernardino, still making real food, still honoring tradition, still small after all these years. That persistence matters. It's a quiet resistance against the forces that made Taco Bell dominant and authentic Mexican restaurants invisible. The legacy we're living with is complicated. Taco Bell democratized access to Mexican flavors. It also distorted American understanding of Mexican food for generations. It built a business empire. It also extracted value from a culture without giving back. It satisfied hunger. It also perpetuated appropriation. All of these things are true simultaneously. So was Taco Bell really built for Americans? Yes, absolutely. Every decision, every ingredient, every innovation was designed for American tastes, American infrastructure, American capitalism. It's as American as apple pie, which is itself an adaptation of European traditions. That's what America does. It takes, it adapts, it simplifies, it sells. Whether that's something to celebrate or critique depends on where you're standing. If you're eating cheap tacos in your car at midnight, it probably feels like a win. If you're a Mexican family watching your culture get commodified and sold by people who don't acknowledge where it came from, it probably feels different. The truth, as always, is messy and uncomfortable and unresolved. Taco Bell exists. It's not going anywhere. Millions of people will keep eating there, keep ordering the same tacos, keep participating in this strange American ritual of consuming culture without really engaging with it. But now you know the story behind the crunchy shell. You know about Glenn Bell and the Montoyas. You know about the workers and the appropriation and the family still making the real thing. You know that what you're eating tastes like nostalgia for something that never existed. And maybe that knowledge changes something. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you still crave those tacos at 2 a.m. Maybe you seek out authentic taquerias next time. Maybe both. The choice, as they say, is yours. The lights are still on at Taco Bell. The drive-thru is still open. Someone's ordering right now. Probably someone who just needed something cheap and fast and exactly what they expected. And somewhere else, someone's making tortillas by hand, honoring traditions that survived despite everything, keeping the real thing alive for anyone willing to seek it out. Both realities exist. Both will continue. The controversy remains. The questions persist. And Taco Bell keeps serving the same tacos. It's always served, built for Americans, by Americans, profiting from Mexico while having almost nothing to do with Mexico. That's the crazy truth. Make of it what you will. Thanks for listening, son. If this one made you think differently about your late-night Taco Bell runs, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more stories about the complicated, messy, fascinating ways food and culture collide in America. And drop a comment telling me what you think. Does Taco Bell get a pass for making Mexican food accessible, or is it the perfect example of cultural appropriation? I genuinely want to know. And hey, we're on Spotify now too. Same stories, same voice, available wherever you need them. Links in the description. Until next time, maybe try a real taqueria. Or don't. Either way, at least now you know the difference.